In today's video, I'm going to talk you through 3 ways that chickens can be the perfect partner for your garden plan, and also some management options for making it work. Hi guys! Gardening with chickens sounds like 2 words that shouldn't be in the same sentence. They come with a reputation of tearing up your garden and scratching about and pulling seedlings up and pooping on everything. And when I first got my chickens, I was a little worried that I was going to have a hard time managing both. Now, for us, running a homestead, our rule is that all animals need a job, unless, of course, you're taking them on as a pet. So when we decided to get the chickens, it was, of course, because we wanted to have a fresh supply of eggs every day. And that is probably the number one reason that most people are attracted to the idea of getting chickens in the first place. However, as I started to learn more about chickens, I learned that there was a lot more that they can actually do for you. And essentially now I'm at a place where they are such a big part of my homestead and my gardening plan that I sort of consider them a natural counterpart to my growing endeavors. So one of the biggest advantages of chickens is, of course, that they are ferocious bug eaters. Not having really thought about this in particular 2 years ago, we got hit pretty bad by Japanese beetles. Now, I don't spray my garden. I don't believe that it's good for the soil. And plus, I don't want any residue left, either organic or inorganic, on my produce. So I was walking around the heavily affected areas of the garden, basically with a red bucket of soapy water. And I was going out every morning because at that time of the day, Japanese beetles are kind of sleepy and you can knock them off the branches and catch them in the bucket. Well, I started to notice that when I would go on my morning rounds, my chickens started following me as I would go in and out of the plants. And as I would tap the branches of this one particular walnut tree, the beetles would drop by the dozens. Most of them would fall into my bucket, but some of them that I didn't catch would fall to the ground, and I noticed that the chickens would snatch them up. So as I observed them, it got to a point that if I actually missed a beetle and I saw it crawling around on the floor, I could literally point to the beetle, and my chickens were almost observing me and would come in after me and eat up the bugs. So what I actually ended up doing was just shaking the whole tree, and as the beetles rained down, the chickens would diligently eat them up, every last one, and it was actually really satisfying to watch. So we had some Asian black chickens at the time, and they seemed particularly to like the Japanese beetles, whereas other chickens weren't as fussed about them. But I noticed that other chickens would seek out different bugs like crickets and grasshoppers. So from breed to breed, I think different birds have maybe got different tastes and different tolerances for foraging for their food, and also what types of bugs they're going to eat. So after that, I started doing some research on different chicken breeds, and we actually ended up adding some Egyptian Phiomies to our flock, since they are known for being very good foragers. They are a little less domesticated than some other chicken breeds, meaning that they're not a chicken that really likes to be petted or cuddled, but they are super diligent in their bug hunting role, which is why we got them. Now, the big question is, how do you get chickens to where you can have them in your garden and they will eat the bugs and not the plants? So firstly, you don't want to be doing this when your plants are young or just freshly planted, because chickens do, and they will, rake around in the soil and they'll scratch the ground. And especially, I found, if you put mulch around the bottom of your plants, they love that. So it's almost going to attract them more. So the good thing about this time of year is that most bugs haven't really emerged yet. And normally by the time the plants are stronger and more established is when the bugs start coming out, which usually isn't a problem for having chickens around your garden. But in the early days, if you are wanting to protect your seedlings, especially from chickens, then there's a method that I've seen that actually has kind of two uses, and it's to make a chicken tunnel, and it can work to either protect your seedlings, or you can actually put your chickens in it and use it like a tractor to move it around so that it keeps your chickens off your garden. So I'm currently working on building a number of these chicken tunnels, which are basically a PVC frame covered in chicken wire, and it's just held together with cable ties. This one was made for me by a wonderful neighbor of mine who knew exactly what to give me as a birthday gift. This one is about 8 foot long, and I have a garden row here which is about 60 foot long. So I would need approximately 6 of these to cover one row. What's really cool about them is that at the end, they have a access door, and so you can just put them all together in a row, and then the chickens would go in and out of there and be able to access the connecting tunnels. Another very cool idea that I've seen on other homesteads is they made what they refer to as a chicken moat, which is basically a tunnel that runs all the way around the perimeter of the garden along the fence line. So if you imagine sort of a low tunnel, if you like, that follows the boundary of the fence. And the way that that's supposed to work, which I think is ingenious, is that it sets up a place where the chickens can patrol the garden up and down and almost act like the first line of defense for any bugs that are coming from outside of the garden area. Brilliant. The second really big advantage to keeping chickens is that they eat weed seeds and weeds. The most amazing video that I think that I've ever seen to date was by a guy who ordered a couple of tons of new compost and literally had a truck deliver it and plonk it in 3 piles on his homestead. And then he basically got his portable poultry net and put his chickens to work on the dirt. He fenced them in, and within 3 days, not only had they scratched through it and examined it for weed seeds and bugs, but they'd also scratched around the pile so much that they'd even spread it out for him. So they had pretty much done the hard work that he didn't have to do. I thought it was brilliant. On our homestead, we mostly have raised beds, and this year we topped up these raised beds with fresh dirt from our compost, and it absolutely contains weed seeds because we compost all of our own hay and all of our vegetable scraps. In fact, right now you can see all of these green sprouts, and they are alfalfa and grass seed growing. So our Wyoming chickens are the ones that get up on these raised beds pretty faithfully every day. And if there's an area that I don't want them pecking or scratching about in, I'll simply cover it over with a row cover, like you see. This one behind me has some strawberry plants, and I literally just drape it over the metal hoops and secure it down with some stones. If I'm sowing seeds that I don't want them to eat, then I will use some sort of plastic container to go over the seeds to protect them. And I haven't seen the chickens trying to remove pots or anything that I've put down. Also, I'll leave those plastic containers over the seed as it sprouts into a seedling just until it gets established. Another thing that chickens can do and be really useful for is eating up any old seed. Now, you might be thinking that seeds last for more than a year, and so why should you throw away good seed on chickens when you have it left over and can use it the following year? Well, you absolutely don't have to discard seed from last year, but here's a trick. If you are growing heirloom crops, that means that you can harvest your own seed and grow new plants from your own. And the advantage of doing this every year is that you grow plants in your garden and your plants become adapted to your environment. So the seed that I collect from my broccoli or my basil from last year is already genetically coded by the parent plant for growing in my garden. And I think it's fascinating. Whereby if I go back to using the store-bought seeds that I started with originally, I'm sort of putting my garden back at a disadvantage because it's already gone through a full season of learning and adapting to my environment. So once I'm done with planting and I know what seed that I've got spare or left over, then I can basically keep it and I'll mix it all up together and keep it aside for a tasty and nutritious treat to give my chickens during times of the year when there isn't so much abundant foraging for them to do. As with all things though, you must research what you're giving to your chickens because it is very important that you keep their diets balanced. Thirdly, chickens produce great fertilizer. So one of the other major benefits of keeping chickens is their manure. It's a great thing to add to your compost pile. Now, just a cautionary note, raw chicken manure can burn and damage plants, so it does need to be composted or aged prior to being used. And in addition, raw manure can contain pathogens that can harm people and animals. However, the great thing about the process of composting is going to kill off any of the nasty bacteria and turn all of that manure into lovely, rich black dirt that over time is going to strengthen the health of your soil by adding nitrogen-rich organic matter. There is a science to composting, but if you're keeping your chickens bedded on straw or shavings, then keeping the litter in a pile and then adding things like grass cuttings and yard trimmings and dead leaves and garden scraps, there's really not much more to it than that. Okay guys, it's question time. So I've got a question from Hope in His Glory. How do we go about choosing our chickens and which chickens are best for beginners? Well, I'll tell you how I got started. I was at a neighbor's house and I saw this magazine, which was just the most attractive picture of eggs I've ever seen. And what it's showing is which breeds lay which color, but there's more to it than that. Most hatcheries will produce a catalog, and if you go to the different breeds on the different pages, it will actually tell you what the nature of the chickens are. So if they are good in hot weather climates or cold weather climates, or if they are good prolific egg layers, or if they put on size, if you're looking at a meat bird or a dual purpose bird. So that's a good place to start, and then you can work out what chickens would suit your climate and your environment. So the second question is really weighing up the advantages over the disadvantage that chickens can sort of tear up your garden a bit or eat your produce. So I really think it depends probably on how much you're growing. I always grow way too much for our family, so it doesn't really matter if my chickens are going to eat a bit. And once my plants are established, I don't really do much to keep my chickens out of there. Last year, they were free to roam amongst the vegetables. I didn't even have a cucumber that I noticed got pecked. They did try peck at some of the cherry tomatoes, but typically go for the ones that fall to the ground anyway. So I didn't really find it a problem. However, I had enough produce where I could sustain a little bit of a loss. If I had a much smaller garden, I'd probably do more to keep my chickens away from the garden at times of when my garden is in production. So following on from the last question, Rachel asks, what do you feed your chickens straight from the garden? I would say herbs are probably the easiest thing that I can just toss in their direction if I'm pruning anything. But they love all kinds of berries. It's actually quite funny, not that it's a berry, but the same shape, a cherry tomato, as I mentioned earlier. If you're watching a chicken try to eat a cherry tomato straight off the plant, it's actually quite funny. They tend not to be able to get a hold of them unless they're squashed or fallen to the ground. Laurie asks, do they eat the plants or just the bugs? I haven't actually seen them really eat the plants themselves, aside from, herb plants. But a neighbor of mine thought that they would go for the plants. When I let my chickens in the garden last year, I'd say they tend to peck at things that they're not sure about. So if you're wanting to protect your produce from being henpecked, like cucumbers, then make sure that you harvest the low-hanging fruit first. But once the plants are established, I haven't seen them eat the plants themselves, like I said, apart from in the herb garden. Kirsten says that I hear that tomato is not good for them or any other vegetable scraps that aren't good. I think that chickens, like all animals, when they're kept naturally and allowed to roam free or free range, they're quite discerning about what they eat. In my early days, I threw a bucket of scraps out on the compost pile, which the chickens had full free access to, not really knowing what they could and couldn't eat. And what was interesting is that they would never touch the avocado, not the skin or the flesh. And I thought it was interesting because at the same time they would eat banana, which is similar in texture. I since learned that avocado is actually toxic to chickens. So it's almost like they have this inbuilt knowledge not to eat it. Other things that shouldn't be given to chickens that I have since learned are things like citrus peel or potato peel, raw onions and raw garlic, or of course dried rice and beans. But when scraps have left my kitchen, those kind of scraps, I haven't seen the chickens touch it. Now, my chickens are free range, and if I was to keep them in a cage, that might be a different story. So you definitely want to make sure that the foods that they do have access to are good for them. I actually have 2 different types of composting bin scrap buckets in my kitchen. I have a pink one for the chickens and a green one for the compost. So I hope that helps. I hope today's video has been useful for you. If you have got any questions, please leave me a comment in the description box below about gardening with chickens. And until next time, bye from me and Mittens.